Good morning, good morning. I am so delighted to see all of you here at the Climate California Live event from the Los Angeles Times. I'm Terry Tang, I'm the executive editor of the Times, and I'm here with our outstanding team of climate and environmental reporters. Just very recently this month, we published a special section on our climate change challenge. The question that all of us confront at this point is whether we're willing and can, and actually it's willing to make the kinds of sacrifices we need to make today to ensure that future generations survive. And our reporters did a fabulous job responding to and exploring that question in ways that are really urgent, surprising, and provocative. And so this morning, today, we want to bring you some of that discussion live on stage here. But before we get started, I wanted to offer a huge thanks to our sponsors for this event, which is the California Center for Climate Change Education at West Los Angeles College. So if we could... Thank you for that big hand for the really important work the center is doing. And so now I want to introduce Monte Morin, who is the climate and environmental editor for the Times.
Hello. All right. Before I introduce the panel, I wanted to mention that the topics and themes that we're going to be discussing today were featured in the Los Angeles Times special edition of our Climate Change Challenge, copies of which are floating around here. Hopefully you were able to get one. The special edition, which focused on youth, was a major tour de force by the Climate California team and was overseen by project editor Alice Short, who you'll meet later today. It's also the reason we're holding this event, so we can engage much more closely on the topic with you all. So our panel, I will start with Sammy Roth, in the center. Sammy is the first ever climate columnist for the Los Angeles Times and writes our very popular Boiling Point newsletter. In April, he was named Journalist of the Year by the Sacramento Press Club, and he has earned all sorts of recognition for his Repowering the West series, including a Gerald Loeb Award. We also have, to Sammy's right, Rosanna Xia. Rosanna is an environment reporter who specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. She was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her reporting on sea level rise, and her book, California Against the Sea, just won an American Book Award. She is also a producer and director of an upcoming feature-length documentary on the legacy of DDT dumping off Los Angeles. And then to my immediate right is Tony Briscoe. Tony is an environment reporter who focuses on air quality and environmental health. Prior to joining the Times, Tony was an investigative reporter for ProPublica and an environmental beat reporter at the Chicago Tribune. He's a recipient of the Peter Lisagor Award for Best Science and Environmental Reporting and a graduate of Michigan State University. All right, so I'm going to direct this first question at Rosanna, but I'd like you all to answer. So Rosanna, you wrote in our Climate Change Challenge that you were perplexed when you heard the term climate anxiety. You wrote, quote, anger, frustration, helplessness, exhaustion. These are the emotions I come across more often when getting to know the communities bracing for or recovering from the devastation of what they've long considered home, end quote. Now, you've talked to a lot of people about the subject since then. What can you tell us about climate anxiety and who gets it?
Oh boy, so we got how much time? So I was really moved by this assignment by Alice Short. She asked me to write a piece on climate anxiety, and I was like, how do I even begin? I'm sure you all feel this too. And I had a couple of threads there, and to me, like being in the field so much, I was thinking about this term climate anxiety, and I actually didn't start really hearing it until I was on book tour last year, and when I started speaking more in colleges and universities. But this idea that like so many people have been so ready to have this conversation, and that the emotional aspects were really the things that once we kind of got past the numbers and everything, that's what people wanted to talk about. So there was that. And then for me, like when I'm talking to communities that we would define as environmental justice communities who have been struggling with, air pollution problems because they've been situated next to a refinery for the last century, communities who have been fighting and worried about the Superfund site next door that has not been cleaned up for decades, I realized that there was kind of a disconnect in the words that we use. So if I go into one of those communities and I say, do you feel climate anxiety? They'll be like, that feels like a bougie problem, or, I can't speak for everyone, but they're like, that's not the terminology that they would use. But I think the frustration, the anger, the feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness, and just feeling like we've been beating against this issue for decades, that was something that I heard. So I think those were some of the early threads as I was exploring what it means to be anxious. And then ultimately, I started talking to psychologists, and then I started talking to sociologists, I talked to an environmental humanist, and realizing too that this idea of anxiety, and climate anxiety specifically, could be categorized as both a mental health conversation and also a cultural phenomenon. So I think also distilling the two was really powerful for me. And when we talk about emotions, ultimately it could either be centered on ourselves. We tend to feel alone in our sorrow and our grief, and I think the call to action that I felt across the board in all my conversations is that it is so important to think beyond yourself, to not feel alone in this process, to realize that everything that we're feeling in terms of the uncertainties that we're facing into the future is not something that we need to face alone, and there's power in being in conversation with each other. So I think the piece that I ended up writing was this journey for myself and also for all the folks that I talked to. And the number of people who told me in our interviews that the conversation alone for this essay was healing to them, was mind expanding to them, was really moving to me too. But ultimately, I would encourage everyone to think about, what are we actually anxious about? Who is experiencing quote unquote anxiety, which in some ways is worrying about something that hasn't happened yet, but there are so many communities that have already been facing, existential crises since, the creation of California, since colonization, since we situated, sacrifice zones in certain industrialized communities. And I think there are just so many ways to shift our climate anxiety into climate empathy, and that was also a pivot point in the essay for me. And yeah, I'm just so moved to see so many folks today willing to come so early on a Thursday to have this conversation, and just thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Rosanna. Sammy, you get a lot of mail. And you're familiar with the concept of climate anxiety. I mean, is there a cure, or can it actually be a beneficial thing?
Well, that's a really good question, and I guess the first thing I would say is everyone should definitely go read Rosanna's essay if you haven't already. Pick up, as Monty said, a copy of the Our Climate Change Challenge Special Edition if you haven't yet, or go find it online. Just search for that, and it'll come up right away, because Rosanna understands the psychology of this and the mental health aspects, I think, better than just about anyone from the research she's done. Just before getting to the can we turn this to our benefit, a couple observations, just not at such a deep psychological level, but in terms of all of the mail that I get, and from I've done a lot of reporting on youth activists, and I think definitely you see this phenomenon not exclusively among young people. There's certainly plenty of older folks, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Third Act movement, people in the, call it the third act of their lives, who are dedicating themselves to climate activism. It's, there's a lot of people across age groups. There's actually polling showing that the age groups that are most concerned about climate change, it's young people and it's older people. Those are the most concerned groups. But if you look at who it is that is most concerned, it makes sense that it would be young people, right? Because we're the ones who are going to be living with the effects of climate change for the longest in our lives, with the fires, with the floods, with the heat waves that if you live here in Los Angeles, you are probably already noticing, like, gee, it's it's harder to sleep than it used to be because it is really, really warm at night. I know that's something that I've been experiencing myself recently. In terms of the privilege aspect, and in terms of communities that have been dealing with, with some of these other insidious aspects of pollution and living near refineries for a long time, is it bougie to feel climate anxiety? One thing that I've seen anecdotally dealing with different groups of people and reporting on climate activism, and one thing that shows up in polling that I find interesting, if you look at polling about who demographically is most concerned about climate change, you actually find the highest levels of concern among non-white communities. You look at Black and Latino communities specifically, you're tending to see the highest levels of concern when you look at polling data compared to white communities about climate change. So it's just, and I think that reflects a lot of what Rosanna's saying, that these are the communities that tend to be hit the hardest by disasters that are influenced by climate change. When you look at when a heat wave hits, who is least able to just turn up the air conditioning and not have to worry about having to pay a higher electricity bill, who is on the front lines of some of these flooding and storm-related disasters, and not able to just cope with having to, who is just not able to cope with that and to pay for those costs, who is in communities in the Central Valley that can't just pump more water from the ground when drought times are real bad. I mean, these are the people being hit worst and hardest by climate change. So it makes sense when these climate disasters are sort of compounded on top of these injustices that already have existed for a long time, that these are maybe the folks who are feeling climate anxiety the hardest. So those are some things that I've seen. So to finally circle back to the question that Monte actually asked me, which is, can you turn climate anxiety to an advantage? I think maybe yes. I mean, when you look at the youth activism, when you look at groups like the Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion or Youth Climate Strike, or even some folks that are maybe a little bit less, I don't know if you want to call it hardcore or radical, and I don't use the term radical with a negative connotation. I think there are a lot of people out there in the world who are taking the anxiety they're feeling and turning it into movements and turning it into real advocacy, and taking that anxiety and not just, sitting at home and feeling like, oh my gosh, what can I do, but going out there into the world and trying to motivate political change, trying to motivate business to change. And, that's not to say that if you can't do that, if you're not in a place where you are able to take that kind of action, that's a negative, that there's something wrong. It's totally understandable if it can be paralyzing, but there are folks out there who are able to do something with it, and I think that's a really powerful thing.
Thank you. Now, Tony Briscoe does a lot of reporting on environmental justice communities, particularly issues involving oil drilling and refineries, and so I was talking to a lot of folks in the communities, and some here's a lot of frustration. I'm just kind of curious on this whole issue of climate anxiety. What do you hear people saying, or sort of what sort of idea do you have of it?
Yeah, I think that, climate anxiety really is across the board. Some of it, is palpable louder than, others, but you can really see climate anxiety as a reflection of the disappearance of climate denialism. I mean, you even have oil companies and all of these other entities, and some of the biggest skeptics now acknowledging it and now quibbling about what should we do about it. But certainly, as Sammy mentioned, disadvantaged communities of color, low-income communities are bearing the most the largest brunt of this issue. And I think, as Rosanna pointed out, it's really about triaging, these problems that we're dealing with. I think we all have things that we're trying to figure out in what priority should we deal with these things, and it's not necessarily a lack of motivation to want to do something about climate change. It's the ability, many times the financial ability, to do something about it. And I think it bears looking on the programs, the climate programs that we have at a state level, at a local level, and seeing, are they reaching these communities that might not have the financial resources to do something about that. It's one thing if you're providing electric car subsidies, to somebody who can afford an electric car and you're giving them a rebate, that's an incentive. but where are you going to get the rest of that money? Or if like you're assuming a lot of times for, if you're placing like a water heater, you're replacing a water heater with, heating pump that might be cleaner, that's electric, that somebody's a landlord. So a lot of times I think that it's about gearing it towards our most vulnerable communities.
Right. Well, that's a very excellent point. It actually segues well into my next question. We heard from a lot of younger climate activists and students when we were reporting for the special edition, and they felt very strongly that they were anxious or angry about society's overall failure to respond quickly to global warming. And they said that older, wealthier, and more powerful, the older, wealthier, and more powerful a person is, the less likely they are to change because they have less to lose. They're not going to be living in the same conditions as a younger person. Is this a fundamental hurdle in our ability to respond and adapt to climate change?
I mean, probably yes.
Yeah, I think, I think I'm gonna lean into just like the words we use to talk about these issues. Like, as we've all shared, just because someone doesn't use the words climate anxiety doesn't mean they're not feeling it. And I think first and foremost, we should meet people where they are in terms of how they're describing what they're experiencing. And I think another word that I've been really wrestling with as a writer and a communicator is the word resilience, and this idea that what does it mean to build, to make our communities more resilient to climate change. And our kind of old school notion of resilience is, measured by our ability to bounce back. Katrina levels New Orleans, and we shall rebuild exactly what we lost and exactly, where we lost it. And in so many ways, our notion of resilience is to maintain the status quo. And so my next question there is, who benefits from the status quo? Who benefits from normal? And this idea that normal is going away. That's the root of a lot of our anxiety, right? That life as we know it is going to change. And so, in the course of my work, I've been really trying to help people expand the way they think about what it means to be resilient, to acknowledge the things that are going to happen, to think about what it means to transform our systems, social, economic, political, in a way that is truly more beneficial to more people. And I think that does start with, back to your question on wealth and who is holding on to the status quo right now. I think that's a really important question to ask. And ultimately, so often we frame this conversation of adapting to sea level rise and adapting to climate change and adapting to extreme heat and adapting to all these things that are terrifying us. We frame it as what it is that we have to sacrifice and give up in order to live in better, to solve climate change, but it doesn't have to be framed about sacrifices. It could really be framed as a conversation and an opportunity to truly, what it is that we can gain, what it is that we can do to make our communities thrive better. And so, I'll answer from kind of the wording perspective, and I'm curious to hear what Sammy and Tony have to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's hard for anybody to change, but specifically if you've been living your life, a certain way for a very long time, and then you're asked to kind of go in a completely different direction. That's difficult for a lot of folks, especially when it, hits on, it's like a change in culture. It's a change to the way you've been living. But the hard part about this issue is that we're going to have to make sacrifices collectively across the board, and we haven't quite seen that at the level that it needs to be. So it's really not like an easy answer to this, but yeah, I have seen a lot of resistance for people to really want to change the way that they're living, whether that's at home, the way that they eat, the cars that they're driving, and a lot of different aspects, I would say.
I'll chime in real fast, and then I think one other thought just to that point really quickly is that, my book editor, and I've been so lucky to have worked with incredible editors over the years, Monte, Alice Short, and then my book editor, she posed to me early in the process, what is the difference between change and loss? And I was like, holy cow, that totally transformed the way I thought about this issue. And I would encourage you all to kind of think about that too. What is it that we're actually afraid of? Is it what it is that we're gonna lose, or is it just change? And is there a way to reshift a lot of these tough conversations towards embracing change?
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with that. I think people are just afraid of change a lot of the time, and I think that can be a hard thing to admit, especially because, I mean, change, I mean, you guys have both said this, change is coming whether we like it or not. I mean, change is here, it's happening all around us. I mean, that is, climate change has the word change in it. I mean, that's what we're here talking about. And so, I mean, I focus on the energy transition in my reporting, and energy transition sounds wonky, but it encompasses so many different things. It encompasses how we get around, switching not only the types of cars we drive, right, from gasoline to electric, but also, having to drive less overall and having to spend less time on freeways and more time on public transit and less time in moving vehicles and more time, ideally, walking, and also reshaping the way our cities look so that they can be more amenable to transit and walking and biking and neighborhoods that are more dense, so we have less sprawl and less, more tree cover, and neighborhoods that are more resilient to heat, and all of these different things that if you're sitting here today, you're probably, somewhat passingly familiar with, and, not cooking with gas anymore, cooking with induction stoves and heating our homes with electricity rather than gas, and all of these changes that, it's like this isn't how we've typically lived in the past. Tony referred to eating differently, eating less meat and less dairy probably as well, because meat and dairy are huge contributors to global warming, and it can be really easy to just sort of, want to not hear all of that and to think, well, there's got to be some technologies that'll just let us keep doing the things pretty much the way we're doing and not have to worry about all of that. But that's just, for the most part, probably not going to be the way it is. And it's a really big, enormous problem, and it can be scary to think about, even if, as you said, and I agree with you, the framing can be positive, the framing can be, wow, we can be healthier, we can be happier even, we can not have to deal with the heat in the same way, we can not have to deal with the fumes coming from our gas stoves that are actually contributing to worse, like, asthma attacks. We can have, streets that we can walk down and have just nicer neighborhoods. But when it's so radically different in some ways from what we're used to, that can still be scary, even if it's better. And so I think that that's something that collectively we're just going to have to find ways to confront. And if I knew what those ways were, I might be doing something different than writing about it.
All right, well, thank you. All right, so now you have all written a lot about the challenges of adapting to climate change, whether it's sea level rise, transitioning our energy infrastructure from fossil fuels to renewable power, preparing our communities for drought, extreme heat, and flooding, or trying to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. What do each of you think we're doing right, and where do you think we're really messing up?
Well, we're building a lot of solar and wind. That seems to be a pretty big success story. There's more, California is getting more than half of its power from renewable sources or carbon-free sources right now, which is pretty good. Coal plants are closing. That's a success story. The big thing, and this is, I'll just make this brief, we're building more renewable power than ever. We're just not building it at the pace that it needs to get built in order to keep global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. We still get something like 35 or 40% of our electricity in California from gas-fired power plants, so lots of progress in getting off of coal, lots of progress in putting more solar and wind and batteries out there, just not happening at the pace that's needed to get to 100% fast enough to bring the rest of the world on board and get all the way off of fossil fuels, particularly gas.
I would say that it's been pretty remarkable to see, how much, we've adopted electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids in California. I think that, we just came out with the statewide greenhouse gas inventory, and we saw that there was a continued downtick in transportation, which is our biggest block of planet warming gases, which is very encouraging.
Right?
Yeah,
40% of the state's emissions are transportation, something like that.
Yeah. So it's a very large amount of our carbon footprint is coming from really the 35 million cars that are on our state's roads, and now I think we've moved into a territory where 1 in 4 cars now is either plug-in hybrid or electric vehicle. I do think that we need to expand that further. One of the biggest caveats, though, is that we're driving farther and our driving habits have not changed. And whether you're driving an electric car or not, we need to reel back that. I think one of the biggest failures that I've seen personally has been the inability, and this has been, as a Californian for 2.5 years, to take public transit here. But, it's a very imperfect system. I will, admit that, but I think that there needs to be more investment into public transit. San Diego actually did something very interesting where I think it was a pilot program for a few weeks that made public transit free. And it was really incredible to see, if you subsidize public transit, how much more that boosted ridership. So I would say, as we're preparing to host the Olympics here in LA, and as we're continuing to grow our state, we have a tremendous ability now, to build out, our rail system, our buses, and really kind of modernize that in a way that could further shrink our largest block of greenhouse gases.
To just briefly add on to Tony's point about the problematic nature of, even as more people drive EVs, people are driving more miles in their gas cars, and that's an issue. That gets back to the point I alluded to earlier about housing and how, as the only, we have such a housing crisis in California, and as the only places where, for the most part, housing is actually getting built right now are further and further on the suburbs and the exurbs further and further out. That gets at the need to sort of continue to densify and build housing within existing dense urban cores, which is something that a lot of people who live in dense urban cores and in neighborhoods don't like. I know NIMBY is an acronym that sets a lot of people off, but that gets back to the sort of discomfort at change. People need to be able to get more comfortable at more housing, more apartments being built within their communities. That is part of the climate problem ultimately.
Yeah, and just to build on what Sammy and Tony have already said, I think I'll step even further back. And my brain is, very type A, and I'll organize things. And I think of climate change stories in 2 broad categories, like mitigation and adaptation. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here for folks who aren't familiar. Mitigation, to me, are all the solutions and all the rhetoric and all the conversations and discussions we're having about stopping global warming, slowing down our rate of global warming. And that's when you hear about net zero emissions and switching to electric and all the transitions that we definitely need to have. And then adaptation is acknowledging all of the consequences of climate change that we have to address, regardless of how much emissions we reduce today, tomorrow, 30 years from now. And both are important. And for me, as the coastal reporter, sea level rise is probably the most pressing, one of the biggest climate change stories on my beat. And sea level rise to me is an adaptation story. If we stopped all carbon emissions tomorrow, the oceans has already absorbed so much of the excess heat from our excess carbon emissions, more than 90% of it since the Industrial Revolution, that a lot of climate change is baked in, a lot of sea level rise is baked into that. So if you look at sea level rise projections between now and 2050, the worst case scenario and the best case scenario are pretty much the same. What the next 50 years look like, that depends on how much we mitigate and how much we slow down. And so both are important, but regardless, between now and 2050, we've got a lot of changes and adaptation strategies that we need to start embracing now. And so I think in general, California talks a great talk on mitigation, but adaptation is where a lot of the political stuff gets, very fraught, because we're asking, again, folks to change, to start now. And it's a little bit trickier to also plan forward and to really transform the way the world as we know it. And so I think we often conflate the two, so folks can be like, oh, California is doing great on climate change because of all these headline-grabbing policies that we're doing. But if you separate it between mitigation and adaptation, I think that's where the nuances get a little bit trickier.
Just personally, if you're talking about the personal change, what do each of you think would be the most difficult thing to do, whether or not it's changing your diet, maybe not traveling as much, or
our own lives? I'll just start. So many things. I wish we could all be model citizens here. I don't know the solution to the amount of travel we need to do today to do our jobs, right? For me, spending time in communities, having an in-person interview, meeting people where they are at. That requires flying, that requires traveling. California is massive. If you want to cover like overlooked or underreported communities, sometimes that takes the most travel, right, to go out of the way to do that. And nothing, like a Zoom interview doesn't replace that. A phone call gets you only so far. So I feel guilty, personally, every time I get on a plane, but then I don't know how else I can do my job right and how I can do the deep listening that I do in my stories. And I really wish I could apparate. Harry Potter reference right there. But yeah, so many other things too.
Tony?
I would say, as a California transplant, like many in this state, air travel, really. I mean, if you think about it, and it's really not brought up that much, we're a tourist destination, but we're also a place that a lot of people like to settle, and we also like to go back home. And so we burn the most aviation fuel of any other state in the nation. And we really haven't found a good way to decarbonize that sector. And when you really kind of analyze that further and how much that is warming the planet, and we haven't found any really positive solutions to that. It is kind of, I feel guilty when I fly back home, but it's really, unless you're driving, and it's really no other good way to go to certain locations. I would say that, and then cooking sometimes. I really like to grill, and so either you're using charcoal or you're using propane or something like that, and you would be. I think a lot of people would be shocked to know that the largest source of particulate pollution, fine particulate matter, which causes like heart attacks, strokes, all sorts of lung disease, is actually from cooking. That's the #1 source. And that's because we're using fossil fuels. I do think that I've tried to kind of move away from that. I think we have a lot of good tools with electric appliances and air fryers. The air fryer is probably one of the best, in my opinion, inventions in the last few years. But yeah, I think that moving away from that is something I've tried to do also.
Sam?
God, probably plastics and online shipping in particular. Yeah, it's there's so much stuff. In terms of like driving and travel and getting around, I've written this before, so I'll just repeat it briefly. I do feel like we're a little bit, especially in Los Angeles, trapped in a system that we didn't build, and that it's important on all of us to try to be part of changing that system and changing the institutions and the. I try to write stories and columns that push for systemic change at a political and an economic level, so that we're not trapped in that system anymore. So it's not that I'm giving myself a free pass on that one, but I think that we shouldn't spend all of our times flagellating ourselves for just every mile you travel. But yeah, one thing that I would like to try to do for myself is just spend less time being like, oh, I can just order that one-day shipping on Amazon, because I do not need that every time, and I know that that's contributing to a lot of problems, not just for the warehouses in the Inland Empire where those trucks are traveling, but also like the literal plastic that is getting into my body when that stuff shows up in my apartment. So that's one that I would want to work on.
Thank you. Now we've got some time for some questions. We've got some written questions, and I think also we'll be able to take some questions from the audience live. But the first question is to Sammy Roth. What is your take on Governor Newsom's undermining rooftop solar and distributed energy resources in general? From Andrea Leon Grossman.
Andrea, thank you for the question. And if you're here, can you wave? I know you. There you are. Hey. Thanks for the question. So short version, because this is a topic I've written about a lot and could expound on for a great deal of time. Governor Newsom and really his appointees at the Public Utilities Commission, but he could stop this if he wanted to, have made some pretty dramatic cutbacks to incentives for rooftop solar power through various forms over the last couple of years. The big one being net metering, the main program that pays people for the rooftop solar power that residential homes generate when they install solar panels. The argument that the Public Utilities Commission and the big utility companies have made for reducing those incentives have been that these are basically large and unfair subsidies that are paid for by other utility customers, and that it drives up electricity rates for everyone else, and that you could get cheaper solar power from large solar farms in other places. There's a long argument that's been happening for years and years over whether that's true, and if so, to what extent it's true. The reality is that basically everyone involved in that argument agrees that we are ultimately going to need lots and lots and lots of rooftop solar power and distributed solar power on warehouses and on parking lots, and in all sorts of places within our cities to meet the clean energy goals that we have in California and to address the climate crisis, and that we are also going to need lots and lots of solar power from large solar farms. On a per kilowatt hour per unit of energy basis, you get economies of scale from large solar farms, and that tends to be cheaper just per unit of energy. However, there's lots of advantages to having solar panels on your rooftops. You don't need to build big transmission lines that are also expensive. You don't pave over wildlife habitat in the desert. It helps people keep their lights on when there are power outages. You're not dependent on the big utilities, which, for understandable reasons, a lot of people don't like. You're going to need lots and lots of all of it. And so I think, and I've written, that it's quite unfortunate that Governor Newsom has gone along with this cutting again and again of rooftop solar incentives. There's a bill sitting on his desk right now that would reverse one of these cutbacks that the Utilities Commission did that really affects not residential homeowners, but schools and apartment buildings and other properties with multiple electric meters that are trying to go solar. That's SB 1374, to be seen if he signs it or vetoes it in the next couple of days. It's something that I've been writing about.
Thanks. All right, now this is a topic that I feel very strongly about this question. It says, we know that large mature trees help cool the air, evapotranspiration, not only shade. Yet they are removed because construction is more profitable. How can we move policies/politicians to realize their value a lot more? Tony, what do you think?
That's a very, very good question. It's a difficult question because I think that there's this schism between intrinsic value and the value that something brings to our life and economic value. And a lot of time our governments and our government agencies value that economic value because it's taxable more than what is good for our environment, because that's not maybe bringing money to their coffers. I would say that there has been a lot of effort to try and put things either into like conservation easements or protecting some of these areas that my colleagues have written more about than I. But I do think that something needs to be done, and it needs to be planned out, whether that's at LA County level, at the state level, to have a plan. I feel like you need to really establish a comprehensive plan, and sometimes we go into decisions and we have these big community impact or environmental impact reports that don't factor in a lot of these other kind of details.
I can confirm that Monty is very low-key passionate about this issue. I'll just add that I was an economist in a different life, and I think something that has come up a lot in the conversations I've had with folks in the planning world and the third-party consulting world and the environmental advocacy world is just, climate change has prompted us to rethink, hopefully, like what it is that we actually assign value to. So the way we traditionally do these environmental impact reviews and all of that, you do a cost-benefit analysis. And in sea level rise adaptation, for example, for years, we didn't actually assign a value to a beach, but we did to property. That has a number, that has an assessment value, that has a tax that you can gain. And so when you look at the cost-benefit analysis of protecting a certain stretch of shoreline, the beach doesn't get valued in the same way because we have not created these systems in which we can value things like trees. And so that's something that I feel like as you participate in the planning process, that's a conversation that I think there's a lot of potential for. I also think kind of to another underlying theme of our conversation today, if you look at where, even in Los Angeles, we have more tree cover and more parks, I think that's also an indication of so many systemic inequities, but also kind of a reflection of who has the time to fight to save the trees in their neighborhood, who has the time to, like, who has time and also the bureaucratic literacy to go through and call their local electeds and their planners to bring more trees into their neighborhood. So I think that's something like, if we are able to support each other and to help build capacity for these conversations, especially in communities that don't have the capacity, that would be important. And lastly, I'll just add, I forget who made this joke, but just, have you all heard the joke where, like, you know, as we're talking about geoengineering and all the things we can do to suck carbon out of the sky and all these different technologies, you know, someone joked that if you put, you know, 10 engineers into a room to come up with the best carbon climate change, you know, solution, they came up with a tree. So I just will end on that note on this answer.
Very good joke. And I think we can take a question or two from the audience.
Okay, so you were talking about resistance to change. Can you talk about the role of the fossil fuel companies' PR campaign to shape our views of renewable energy and shaping society's resistance to change?
Yeah, you know, I think that we have seen a growing body of evidence from, you know, academics, you know, investigative journalism, and what have you, going into internal documents that are warehoused in different places from these companies that have showed that they knew well in advance, I want to say back to the 60s, that climate change was happening. So I think it's pretty well established that no one can deny that climate change is happening and that they were a driving influence, the fossil fuel industry. I do think we're in this next phase now where it's about holding them accountable, and I think that California has really led the way with the Attorney General filing suit for deceiving the public, for you know, their claims that climate change was not happening, that they were not a part of that, and most recently with the plastic pollution crisis that we're dealing with too. So now I think that we're finally moving into a direction where they will be held accountable, a lot of companies, for greenwashing.
Yeah, two quick things to add. And is everyone here familiar with or heard the term Exxon knew? As in Exxon knew about climate change for decades and decades. I just want to shout out Susanne Rust, our colleague sitting here. Susanne, raise your hand. Yeah, that's Susanne Rust, who helped break that story for the LA Times in 2015. Exxon knew and won or finalist, I don't remember, for the Pulitzer Prize for that story. So anyway, amazing work, and that's why we know about that. So yeah, so as Tony said, there is that long history, and I think that what's interesting now is that rather than outright deny climate change, which Exxon and Chevron and Shell and the other fossil fuel companies know they can't get away with anymore, what they've kind of moved on to as the individual who asked the question alluded to, is the sort of delay, you know, sort of tactic of, well, climate change is happening, but renewable energy can't really solve the problem. It's too unreliable. It's, you know, we're never going to be able to meet society's energy needs with just solar and wind. So what we really need to do is, continue to mostly use fossil fuels for the foreseeable future until there's some crazy breakthrough that, in their mind is never really going to happen. And so we need to keep burning oil and gas, but we'll find a way to capture the carbon. Don't worry, we're spending lots and lots of money on this stuff. Just trust us, we'll get there. Give us huge tax subsidies for carbon capture. We'll pull it out of the sky, or we'll capture it in our refineries and we'll bury it in the ground, and trust us. And really, when the investigative journalism that's been done, this is why you need good journalism, you look at the amount of their capital budgets that they're spending on this stuff, and it's like 0.1% or maybe 1% or 2% at the most at some of these companies, and the number of facilities worldwide that are actually doing actual carbon capture work, it's like you can count them on one or maybe two hands. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. So that's what you're seeing today from the fossil fuel companies, and it's very devious and needs to be called out.
All right, I think we're at our time, so thank you very much.
Good morning. Welcome to our lifestyle and sustainability panel. I like to think of it as good habits and bad habits. My name is Alice Short, and I'm a longtime editor at the LA Times. And we have a great panel. Susanne Rust, the plastic queen. We'll talk more about that later. Investigative reporter, specializing in environmental issues. You were the editor of Columbia University's Energy and Environmental Reporting Project. Let's see, you started your career in 2003 as a science reporter in Milwaukee at the Journal Sentinel. And you are the recipient of a number of journalism awards, which were brought up at the prior panel. Thank you for being here. You just jetted in from New York recently, where she was accepting another award. Lila Seidman is a reporter who is focusing on a lot of wildlife and outdoor activity. And so I'm hoping that she'll be able to talk about the way sometimes some people trash the outdoors. And then Russ Mitchell. He covers energy technology and policy, writes a lot about electric vehicles. I will just say that the first time I met Russ, he said, "What do you drive?" I said, "An old Prius, it's dirty, and I'm going to drive it into the ground." And you said that was very appropriate. So, all good. I would like to start out talking about plastic, because it's something that all of us experience 24 hours a day. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that story about the lawsuit and Exxon.
Yes, so on Monday, Tony Briscoe, who you saw earlier, and I filed a story about the California Attorney General, Rob Bonta, has filed a lawsuit against ExxonMobil for having deceived the public about the possibility of plastic recycling. Only about, I know the number says 9% of all plastic can actually be recycled. The number is actually closer to 5%. For years, we were told that if we put plastic into our blue bin, it would get transformed into new plastic and new materials. In fact, it just ends up going to landfill. It has been going on for so long, and plastic production has increased year to year to year to year, that we are now just swimming in plastic. And this is what the Attorney General is fighting against. And he is, if his lawsuit goes through and he wins, there will be an abatement fund. ExxonMobil will have to pay to help clean up California's environment landscape. And there will be, there's a charge for disgorgement, which means the profits that they made on the selling of plastic that they have contributed to over 40 years will also have to be given up. That's a civil lawsuit, and they have to stop deceiving the public and be truthful about what actually happens to plastic. So it's quite a historic and major lawsuit. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you. So this is something that maybe any of you might want to talk about, but I just recently read a book by Ed Humes, Garbology, and he had a chapter about the state of Maine that has a polluter's pay law. The official name is Extended Producer Responsibility Law. And other states have adopted something similar. The idea is that the people who produce the plastic, the pollution, need to pay for that, so consumers and municipalities do not. It has not taken effect anywhere, of course. It will take years if it happens at all. And I wonder if any of you think that is particularly promising, if it's going to go anywhere. It sounds amazing, but I don't know.
Well, California passed a bill called SB 54,
Right.
which is modeled on that as well. And it is underway. It will be interesting, particularly as a reporter, to follow and see exactly what happens. I think one of the concerns with an extended producer responsibility program is similar to what we were discussing, my brilliant panelists were discussing before, about a long history of the fossil fuel companies and deception. It will be up to these producers to be putting this program in order, making sure that things are being recycled, that the plastic that is being produced is actually recyclable, that money is going to where it is supposed to go. So this is, the idea is that they are going to be responsible, they are going to be paying for all of this, and so thank goodness for the LA Times climate desk. We will be watching to see what happens. But yes, I think we can all say, you know, it's one of those the fox is watching the hen house kind of situation. So we'll see.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinarily difficult problem because plastic is everywhere you look. Our entire economy and culture is heavily dependent on plastic right now. So just setting up the mechanisms and who to charge, who to tax is going to be very difficult. Everybody in the room probably can see plastic and is perhaps wearing plastic. So one thing we can do as individuals is just try to cut back on that as much as possible.
Lila, I want you to talk a little bit about some of the coverage you've done in public spaces, parks, national parks, polluted national parks. Pretty ironic that it's a place to commune with nature and we are not treating them well.
Yeah, well, you referencing this piece of legislation made me think about a discussion. Sorry, this is a bit tangential, but you know, this idea of, well, you can have the policy, but, and this one would be, the onus would be on the producer, but you know, a lot of times it does come down to the community. And for example, I just wrote about a bear that was euthanized in Mammoth, and I spoke to California wildlife officials, and they said, well, at the end of the day, it comes down to the people who are interacting with wildlife. We cannot be there at in every single instance interceding. And so I think a lot of times that is that personal responsibility piece that you can pass, you know, policy and law, but you know, you can't enforce maybe every single personal action that people are taking. And that's a big piece of people using public lands, because public lands actually do belong to everybody, and so you have this right to go onto them. And a lot of public land managers are kind of loath to limit public access, and yet, you know, there's this tension where you have this right to be on it, but then, you know, you're supposed to have this responsibility also as an individual to steward it. And so I constantly hear about these issues erupting in different parts. I mean, a previous LA Times writer wrote about like the East Fork of the San Gabriel, where there are so many people coming in, and this could be their backyard. I mean, this is also, you know, for a lot of people, this is the recreation they have, and it's no or low cost for them. But, you know, if you're leaving trash, then, and it's accumulating, you know, then there can be backlash where people want to kind of gatekeep and say, we need to limit access. And so this is just something that's constantly playing out in, you know, the Angeles National Forest and other places that are very, very close to large population centers. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, but you just raised another issue for me anyway, about wildlife. You and I were talking about this the other day, about how when we are encroaching continuously in areas that maybe weren't built upon before, and areas that are really built up, things like poisons. We were talking about rat poison, and how it sometimes shows up in wildlife that's lying on the side of the road. What's to be done about any of that?
Yeah, I got an email last night saying that the governor had signed an expansion of a moratorium on what's known as first-generation rodenticides. And so, you know, people who want to see the protection of wildlife have been very supportive of this. It restricts the use in certain wildlife areas, and it will apparently take these rodenticides off the shelf. So that's rat poison. And like you mentioned, I mean, it's very different from plastic, but it's one of these things where, the idea was to control a certain type of species, in this case, rats. And you could think about, maybe you disagree or agree with that. But what happens is larger animals eat the rats, and then they themselves experience the effect of these rodenticides. And it could be really gnarly. Like I heard, it causes internal bleeding. And I spoke to a scientist with the National Park Service who studies mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains, and they said pretty much every single animal they test, they see a presence of rat poison. So is really prevalent. They had already put a moratorium on what's known as second-generation rodenticides, which were considered even worse. But they're still seeing it show up, so they hope that this will be able to curb some of the impact that they're seeing.
Thank you. Russ, you've written a lot about EVs, but I would like to kick this off just by asking you to talk a little bit about hydrogen fuel cells and what we might see in the next couple of years or the next decade on this.
Maybe the next decade, the next couple of years, not too much. The state has sunk a lot of money into, and I'm talking about individual automobiles and pickup trucks now, has sunk a lot of money into building out subsidies and fuel cell stations that provide hydrogen for fuel cell cars. A couple of the automakers have gone along, Toyota and Hyundai most specifically. The problem is that the system hasn't been built out anywhere close to what the state has anticipated. So the auto companies aren't selling as many cars as they anticipated. And the whole reputation of the hydrogen fuel cell cars is going down the tubes. You're going to ask me?
No, it's so, because we don't have the infrastructure, it's going down the tubes.
Well, there are some issues with hydrogen fuel cell cars that are very expensive, but it's mostly a supply chain issue. It's mostly the hydrogen fuel that's very expensive, and the car companies were subsidizing the owners of fuel cell cars to, I think, to a certain level of free hydrogen fuel per year. But when that ends, they have to pay it themselves, and the price of hydrogen has tripled over the last couple of years. When it comes to trucks, there's a lot more opportunity for long-haul trucks. Electric drive for trucks hasn't really been proven out for long-haul trucks, and hydrogen fuel cell trucks are much more likely to emerge in that sector. It's the whole hydrogen station system will be easier to build out because you can build it along freeways. So it makes a lot more sense there, and I think we're going to see a lot more action in trucking than in automobiles.
Speaking of trucks, the first time I read about the Ford Lightning,
yes,
I thought, wow, this is it. This is a turning point in the country. It hasn't quite turned out that way, though.
That's right. Part of there are drawbacks. They're not, they can't tow as much as a gasoline truck. They have a stated range, but because of the aerodynamic configuration, they use up a lot of battery power than was hoped. And I actually drove a Lightning from where I live in the Bay Area down here not too long ago. And the truck itself was great. They're excellent vehicles. And if you don't need to do heavy towing, I would recommend them to anybody who uses a pickup truck and can live within the range. But the range is a problem. It took almost twice as long to get down because I was searching for public charging stations. Some worked, some didn't. There were long lines. It was just, it was really, really a hassle.
You've written about how the EV market is weakening. That must be a part of it.
Come again? Sorry.
You've written about how the EV market is weakening. So again, the infrastructure issues. Yeah. I mean, is that?
Well, we'll wait to see what happens. But in very short term, the last couple 3 quarters, it's the growth has slowed.
Yeah.
And in some markets, it's flattened out. And part of the reason is that Teslas are flattening even faster, and especially in places like California. And the theory is that people are really don't want to give money to Elon Musk. This may be a temporary phenomenon. The faster that reliable infrastructure can be built out, the better it's going to be for electric vehicles.
Sure. Thank you. I would like to return to plastic. It's a favorite topic of mine. Susanne, last year, a Los Angeles Times editor asked you to write a diary of your plastic use for a week. That would be me. And I think you found some things that maybe surprised you a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. I consider myself a very environmentally conscious person, but not conscious enough where I'd ever sat down before to actually write down everything that I was using in terms of plastic. And Alice asked me to do this, and it was a little bit mind-blowing. I first took stock of just the things that were sitting on my desk, and of course everything in front of me had plastic in it, from my AirPods to my computer. And then I went out for a swim, and everything I use while I swim is some form of plastic. I also, my husband and I, we have a blended family. We have 5 Gen Zers in the house, and I went and started looking through our garbage, and it was an unbelievable pile of single-use plastics that I was putting into my recycling bin. It was really, I think I called it a soul-crushing assignment to realize just how much plastic I use. Some of it is essential, right? I mean, you know, I can't say my swim stuff is essential, but swimming would be a lot more difficult if I had, you know, glass goggles and, you know, a cloth hat or something, or a cap. But some of it clearly isn't. I took a flight during this assignment from San Francisco to Montreal, and just bypassing through the airport, getting food on the plane, getting drinks. I had brought my own steel cup, but they wouldn't put water into the steel cup. They put it first into a plastic cup so that I could pour it into my steel cup. And when I started thinking about all the people that were sitting on this plane, and you know, they came through twice all the plastic that was just thrown away just after this flight, and then you start thinking of all the flights that are happening every day throughout the nation, throughout the world. It is again, soul crushing is the only way I could describe it.
Well, I'm glad I could help with that. We have a question, a pre-written question from the audience, which I think is pretty fascinating. And any or all of you may have some thoughts about this. Would you consider doing an in-depth story on the impact of artificial turf? not something I've thought a lot about, and I don't know if you all have any feelings about it, but it is a lot of places. I do a lot of walking in my neighborhood, and I continue to marvel from time to time at brilliant, bright green lawns and wonder, how did they do this? And it's plastic.
Okay, well, Alice, you're killing me here because I'm actually working on a story about this right now. So whoever asked, thank you. We're thinking the same stuff. It's a really big deal. I mean, you start looking at the schools. There's been this fight among school boards and in communities about water. So I need to talk to you, Ian, about this. But do we spend money on water to grow grass, or do we get artificial turf? And so there have been these battles going out in school system across the state on what to do. But artificial turf is a real problem. There's the issue of plastic and of course, the plastics that come off when it's hot, we're all breathing it, but then the harm that it causes to children, it gets very, very hot. And then you start thinking about soil and entire ecosystems. It is problematic, but it's a really big deal because we are also suffering from water shortage in this state. So anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say it's very depressing to look at. So I'm excited to read the story.
Well, the big issue, of course, is that the economy is based on, businesses are based on making things cheaper and more efficient. And in a lot of ways, artificial turf is cheaper and more efficient than grass, even if it's less human. The plastic cups on the planes that they put your coffee or tea in, that's so that it's more efficient to clean the trays and make the turnaround faster. So plastic is cheap. It's useful in a lot of ways, and people are using it to make everything. We're becoming more and more efficient, but less human all the time, and I don't think human culture has even begun to really fully deal with that.
Yeah, also, I was speaking to a couple of folks before this event, and this might be in the pile of questions, but they asked me, like, how do you attract native animals? And obviously, the number one way to do that is to plant native plants, which is not plastic turf. So if you want to contribute to the ecosystem, that wouldn't be where you start. The emphasis is on, you could plant drought tolerant plants, and there's definitely a lot of emphasis on that right now. But if you want to see monarch butterflies and other pollinators in your yard, I don't think artificial turf will bring them.
Fair enough.
Can I say, I just realized something about myself when I talked about grass and plants being more human. It's more natural. And since we're all getting depressed today, maybe humans are plastic makers. Who knows what's really human, but it's up to us to decide what human is I guess my main point.
That's right.
Well, and we're becoming increasingly plastic.
Yeah.
It's true, literally.
So we have a question that says, how might we include climate change in our daily conversations, and what kind of difference could that make? Lila, it reminds me a little bit of a story you did recently on forest schools about bringing young children, into nature, and how that could possibly make them thinking about being stewards of the planet from an early age. Can you talk a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, this photo right there, I keep seeing it. I love that photo. I'm sorry, what was the underlying question that they asked?
Just how might we include climate change in our daily conversations? And they do that subtly at these schools.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. This forest schools, which it's a pretty simple premise. It's actually just bringing kids outside for a large portion of their day. The photo before this one was taken at a Pasadena public park. They told me that there are multiple schools just operating at that one Pasadena park, and that within the last couple of years, these schools have sprouted up I don't want to say like wildfire, but they have increased rapidly. I think it was a 200% increase nationally since 2017, and California is among the top 3 states with the highest number of schools, so it's a big thing here. And they're primarily focused on preschool-aged kids, which I found really fascinating since so much of the conversation around climate change is with teenagers, which makes a lot of sense. They're kind of the ones inheriting these problems, as our other colleagues talked about. And I asked these schools, how do you talk about climate change? But most of the children are too young to understand really complex topics. Like, they're not going to be talking about methane emissions and stuff like that with 2-year-olds. But they basically told me that by having these experiences in nature and being connected to the land and just being outside and experiencing what heat is, and they sometimes have to bring water with them for certain activities, but they limit it, and they'll have a discussion around that, around why they're doing that. And so to plant these really early seeds, and according to the folks involved with this movement, they see it as a way to sort of develop climate stewardship very, very early, even before you really know, you're just living these concepts.
And I know that we had some stories for this particular collection about climate change curriculum in public schools, which is just kind of, in general, more of a thought than a reality. Some schools, some charter schools are working on it. Any thoughts about how we might make that better, how we might improve on it? I mean, if you can start at the nursery school level and the kindergarten level, how can we move that forward? Or can we move it forward? How can we make it a part of our curriculum? The state of California, LA Unified, LA County have all said it needs to happen, but it's slow going.
Well, I think the kind of thing that Lila was writing about, those programs are really important. I mean, if you think about us as a species, human beings, we grow up in a place and we sort of, we set our foundation of what is normal from where we grow up. And if you provide children with experience in the outdoors, with a natural system, with prioritizing that natural system, they will grow up into adults who respect and want that natural system. I mean, I worry all the time. I wrote briefly about it in this section about seeing with my own children. They grow up in this world that doesn't look like the world I grew up in, where plastic, for instance, is something that just is everywhere all of the time. And so sort of instilling within these growing minds a different way of living, I think will help these people grow up into people who really value this. I'm not sure I said that well, but.
The connection with nature is essential, I think, and I'm just spouting off here, not based on any of my reporting. I don't really cover this stuff. I do have a child, and one thing I learned is that one thing to do is to, watching my child and her friends in their video games, it's mostly boys, not girls, but get them off the video games, to get them outside, get them off their phones, which my daughter is attached to. And one of the best ways to do that is to limit your own use of phones and make sure that you're going out in nature with them as much as you can growing up. So it's not just schools, I think it's parenting too.
Yeah, I will say one fascinating thing that came out of my reporting on the schools is this idea of regulation, because, on one hand, if they are not able to be regulated and not able to be licensed, this prevents them from tapping public funding, and so that means that they're all tuition-based, and one of the biggest criticisms is they're only accessible for wealthy families who can pay that. But so many, quite a few of the schools do not want to be licensed because they're like, this is going to steal the magic from the program. We need to be able to be out in nature doing semi-managed risky things. And so that's another just piece of tension with these schools in particular. Like, how do you put that into a framework of regulation where you can still maintain all the good things that they're saying this creates, which is that connection to nature that they take with them as they grow up.
Thank you. I think that we are ready to take some questions from the audience for our panelists.
Thank you. Thanks for being here today. I am trying to have conversations with friends in regards to climate change, but I find that I'm afraid to talk to some who are on the other political side of the aisle, and they are often deniers and saying that it's cyclical, that it has nothing to do with, there's no science behind it. How do I talk to them so that I can sound intelligent and tell them, no, there's really something going on here?
Well, I do find, if you can, avoiding the term climate change is for these kinds of conversations often essential. And you can talk about things that are happening in the world. You can talk about drought, you can talk about wildfire without bringing up the term. You'll still somehow, it always ends up getting back to it. But there are ways of discussing it. I was in New York earlier this week, and I was talking to some funders who work in the climate change sphere around the world, and they say they work with people all the time who think climate change is a hoax, but they couch it in different ways, right? They talk about job security, new technology, when they're looking for solutions. So you just have to be really creative. But yeah, climate change is one of those, you say it and some people are gonna come out and bite your head off.
Yeah, I think trying different methods resonate with different people. I was talking to a scientist, this was about bugs, so it wasn't political, but she was talking about how she sort of does PR for bugs, and for certain people saying what they do for the ecosystem will resonate with certain people, and for other people it's just seeing a beautiful bug or a bug tending to its children. So for some people it's emotional, for some people it's factual. I was having a conversation with my partner who's a mountain climber, and there's an area where there are these endangered frogs near what was formerly a really popular mountain climbing destination, and his friend read the story and said, well, what's a couple frogs when we're talking about a bunch of climbers? So I'm trying to bring facts into it, there's only X amount of frogs. I know this is sort of tangential, but anyway, it's just what can you do to sort of meet people where they're at and find out what resonates with them? For some people it will be emotional, for some people it will be scientific, and kind of figuring that out and starting the conversation from there.
One idea too is to, Rosanna in the earlier panel was talking about mitigation and adaptability or adaptation, and everybody, if somebody is saying that the Earth's not warming, they can have all kinds of opinions about why, but if they say it's not warming, then you can dismiss them as just an idiot. But most people, whatever their political persuasion, will agree that the Earth is warming, and to focus the conversations on adaptability. We need to adapt to climate change, and this is going to be there's going to have to be a lot of political action and political support for adaptation, and I think that those people may be a little bit more willing to have that kind of a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you all again for joining us. We're going to take a quick break, about 15 minutes, and while we wait for the next panel, we are going to present a special music performance on video of Debussy's La Mer, conducted by Colburn graduate and Salonen conducting fellow Elias Peter Brown. This was his concert thesis, and it's centered around climate grief and the sense of loss felt in the face of changing ecological conditions. And we felt that this performance would be very appropriate for today's event. Thank you. We'll see you all in a few minutes. Thank you. And just a reference to what you were listening to before, and a thank you to the Colburn School for providing this clip of Elias Peter Brown's concert that was centered around climate grief. He was mentored by Esa-Pekka Salonen and was recently named assistant conductor of the Odense Symphony in Denmark, which is pretty amazing. All right, welcome to the panel on activism, youth, and the birth of rage, although I think rage has actually been around for a while. I am going to introduce our amazing panelists in no particular order, but anyway, because you're next to me. Noah Haggerty is an environment, health, and science reporter at the LA Times with a background in physics. He conducted research on spacecraft propulsion, fusion energy, and plasma, as one does. Anyway, he joined the Times this year as an AAAS mass media fellow. Sammy Roth, I suspect, needs no introduction. He's climate environmental columnist for the LA Times. He writes the Boiling Point newsletter and may be the most prolific writer I have ever encountered in my entire life. Very impressive. Ian James, our water reporter, focuses on water in California and the West. And before he joined the LA Times, he was an environmental reporter at the Arizona Republic and the Desert Sun. And he used to work for AP as a correspondent in the Caribbean and bureau chief in Venezuela, which is very cool. And finally, Alyssa Jaipersaud, thank you for joining us. I have a lot to say about Alyssa, sorry. She wrote one of our essays on climate activism for this particular collection of stories. She moved to Los Angeles to go to USC, where she earned a Bachelor of Science in Industrial and Systems Engineering with a minor in law and public policy, and she's completing a Master's of Science in Sustainable Engineering, which is pretty amazing. When she was writing this essay, I had to beg her for some more personal detail. So she grew up in Secaucus, New Jersey, and when she was in high school, she worked with the city's environmental department for 3 years. At a time, she learned a lot about climate change. She was canvassing to promote eco-friendly living and educated residents on how to compost at home. And she also, among other things, certified local businesses as green, depending on whether or not they follow practices set by the Sustainable Jersey Network, which I think is amazing. So thank you for joining us. All right, so we're here to talk about all sorts of things, but let me bring up the Sunrise Movement, and I'm going to look at you or anyone who would like to talk about that. And what kind of an organization is it? Is it Hold Your Feet to the Fire organization or something else?
I would say Hold Your Feet to the Fire. I think a lot of young people have grown up knowing that climate change is real and knowing that the way that they're going to have to live is going to have to change. And so I see, talking to organizations like these, kind of creating a vision outside of the system and then trying to pull the system toward them. And what you see in the news a lot is kind of their, bigger protests trying to hold people accountable. I know they were at Kamala Harris's residence, and Sam recently reported on this. But that's not all that they have. Just going out and protesting is not enough to sustain a movement. And so on the backside, you kind of have a softer side where they're focusing a lot on community building, creating this shared vision, and basically, like, if you are working a full day or spending a full day at school, you don't want to just go home and sit on another Zoom meeting. You want to be spending time with your community. And so they have a strong emphasis on building a sense of community, working with friends to help sustain a movement.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything Noah said is absolutely correct. And I think that what I would add is that the Sunrise Movement, I think they maybe don't get enough credit for how politically effective they've been. I mean, the term Green New Deal, I guess I don't know for certain whether they coined that term, but they certainly popularized it and brought it into the political lexicon in a way where, I mean, everyone from Trump on the one end to President Biden and Vice President Harris on the other end. I mean, this is a term that everyone knows and either champions or derides or somewhere in between. I mean, they didn't endorse in 2020 or 2020, and yet you had pretty much everyone that year, endorsing in concept on the Democratic side the Green New Deal. You had, you had the Sunrise Movement basically coming into existence at the end of 2018 in a big way, and sitting in on people's offices in Washington, D.C. and getting arrested. And then you had Democrats campaigning for the presidency on this, and then lo and behold, you had, despite unified Republican opposition in Congress and Joe Manchin flip-flopping back and forth like a dozen times, somehow the Democrats squeaking it through with 50 votes, the Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden's big $370 billion climate and clean energy bill, which, I remember reporting on it throughout that year, thinking at various times that there was no way it was ever going to happen. And I think that not just the Sunrise Movement, there are other activist groups out there, both traditional groups, the Sierra Club, the NRDC, that have been out there doing this forever, and other groups, some of which I mentioned earlier. But the Sunrise Movement was really at the heart of that. And so I think that, whatever you may think of their tactics, as Noah mentioned, I was at Vice President Harris's outside her home in Brentwood earlier this week, where you had a group of 15 or 16 Sunrise activists, and they were pretty unhappy with her remarks at the debate recently, where she, in this sort of tactic to swing to the center and try to win some moderate votes in Pennsylvania, recently talking about record oil and gas production under the Biden administration and how great that is, and they didn't love that. They'd like her to release a real climate plan, which she hasn't done on the campaign trail. And two of them got arrested outside of her house. And whether you think that's a smart tactic for Sunrise or not, that's in the eye of the beholder. But they have been super, super effective at getting the Democratic Party to embrace more real climate policy and at getting stuff done so far.
Thank you. Apparently there's an election this year. That something you said sort of brought that up in my mind. And, I'm hoping any or all of you can talk about how the candidates are approaching this, I won't say climate change, this phenomenon, and especially for younger voters, as you were talking about, not necessarily an embrace of the Democratic Party. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that from anyone. You guys have thoughts, I know you do. Alyssa, thoughts?
Sure, I could say that as far as supporting the Democratic Party, I feel like for youth, and at least for myself, I can say it's kind of another election where like anyone but Trump and the Harris Party has been putting themselves forth as supporting keeping the Green New Deal, the Inflation Reduction Act, and kind of the big move for Biden was bringing us back into Paris. So I think as long as she can continue that, then Gen Z is going to be voting for her, because what's our other option?
Just a quick comment. I mean, the Sunrise Movement has not endorsed Kamala Harris for president, but I asked one of the lead organizers at this protest on Monday, where are you guys at on this election? And her comment was, we are trying to mobilize, we need to defeat Donald Trump. We're mobilizing, millions of voter turnouts to defeat Donald Trump. In practice, that means we're trying to get Kamala Harris elected. So, whether or not it's an endorsement or not, that's kind of what they're trying to do.
Sure.
And I think in general, a lot of Gen Zers, especially in the activism space, have just been dissatisfied. They see a mismatch between the urgency in which leaders are speaking and the urgency that they feel. And by not creating an endorsement or giving an endorsement, they're keeping a pressure on politicians, and by continuing to protest them, they're keeping a pressure to hopefully, like we live in a two-party system, it's going to be the Democrat or the Republican, sorry, Jill Stein, and so that it gives them leverage to continue, I guess, having an impact and trying to pull the party that they see as most willing to act on climate change closer to the urgency that they feel.
Thank you. Ian, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit, or maybe a lot, about water. There's a lot of activism around water, certainly in the state of California, whether it involves indigenous peoples or people in farming communities who would like to have water, clean water, as they watch Big Ag, Big Almond, it's one of my favorite terms, as they watch Big Almond pump water out, they watch the ground shrink. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about activism that involves water.
Sure. I'm very interested in following the work of activists on various different water topics. That can include activism around access to clean water, as well as ecological protection or conservation. There are just so many, water does touch so many different topics. And often I'm looking at a topic that deals with a certain watershed and how people are managing water there. But then, of course, we also have this complicated hydraulic system that we depend on, where we're getting water from hundreds of miles away, and there are also decisions being made about how that water will be used and what would be, in the public interest. And so a big part of my work is about talking with activists who are looking at these issues. And one recent story that I've been working on is following the removal of dams on the Klamath River. And it's really remarkable how activism over a period of 20 years or more, members of the Karuk and Yurok tribe really led to this massive change and decision by Pacificor to remove these hydroelectric dams, which were no longer necessary. They didn't produce a lot of power, and additionally, the bringing them up to current environmental standards would have required a lot of investment, and so the company just made a dollars and cents decision to remove these dams. So they're a different type of dam than a lot of the dams that we know in California that supply our water. But in any case, it was a long and involved process of activists speaking out about these dams that led to this ultimate decision, which is now bringing the potential to bring back salmon to these upriver areas where they can spawn better. And of course, salmon populations are crashing in California. So it's been interesting to see that activism and learn about people who, some of them, they started in this activism when they were as young as 7 or 8 years old. And so they were going to meetings and speaking out about the importance of making this change. And I think a lot of people in that region of the state are feeling very empowered about the potential to bring about change because of what they've been able to achieve.
Let's talk a little bit about farming communities, big agriculture. What's going on there in terms of activism?
That is a big topic.
Yep. Take any part of it you'd like.
Yeah, so I would say there are various aspects of it. So we have the Central Valley Project, which brings water from Northern California to the Central Valley for agriculture. There are debates ongoing about how much water should be taken out of rivers, what sort of protections should be in place for fish. The same debates are raging about the use of the State Water Project and how it should be managed, these two big canal systems that bring water. And of course, agriculture has expanded a lot over the years and has depended not only on the surface supplies, but the underground supplies, which especially in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley have been declining at rapid rates. And so there's this process under the state's groundwater law to try to get a handle on this problem through local management, but with the state serving as an enforcer. And so as part
How's
of that,
that working?
Well, I recently went to a conference about this, and I think some of the people who are most knowledgeable about it said they would probably give it a C+, B-.
Okay.
That there's progress, there's a focus on managing the water that's there in these regions, but it's a long, complicated process. It involves local agencies that are largely dominated by the big users of water, and so there are a lot of difficult discussions about how does each region get to sustainability, especially when they have like a dozen different local agencies that are in some cases kind of splintering and taking their own local interests against each other. But I think your question was about activism, and there are several organizations that have been active in that process. Community Water Center comes to mind, Leadership Council. These are organizations that focus on rural drinking water supplies and making sure that their interests are protected, and so they have regularly been speaking out and saying that, as we discuss long-term water management, it's important that communities' drinking water supplies be protected because there are problems that are linked to water overuse, whether that's the quality of water that can be made worse because of the overpumping and kind of the collapsing of the underground layers there, or it can actually leave some communities with dry wells, as it has in past droughts. And so planning for agriculture in the long term is going to mean smaller agricultural water use and a reduced amount of farmland in production. And so those are difficult questions that have various interest groups on kind of a push and pull of interests, fighting it out through both these local processes and, when they can, state legislative processes.
So the Los Angeles Times ran a story several years ago involving water rights in Northern California for rice farmers. The water rights were maybe 120 years old. It just kind of stuck in my mind. How does a concerned community, a state, any sort of level of concern, how do we deal with that? It's the law, but how do we get things changed like that? Or do we?
Is this my question?
Yes. Yes. No, so, very old, more than 100 years old agreements to use water in a certain way. I mean, you see that all over the state.
And that has been a difficult topic to approach in Sacramento. There have been proposals to allow for more state oversight, or at least verification of senior water rights. These water rights that, if I remember correctly, is maybe about a third of the volume of water, something like that. It's a very large amount. And these most senior rights were acquired in the late 1800s, early 1900s by whoever was there. These farmers at the time claiming water rights, in some cases by nailing a notice up on a tree, or in some cases, it was very early taking of water after the removal of indigenous people from a lot of these areas. And so I think there are increasingly debates in Sacramento about what would make sense to change the water rights system. But it seems like a lot of those discussions are sort of nibbling around the edges of doing anything substantial, and largely because there are a lot of financial interests involved for the agricultural water districts in the cities that hold these senior water rights.
I mean, it always strikes me, and if you don't mind my cutting in for just a second, Alice, just reading your stories, the big farmers in the water districts, they have quite a lot of political power, right? And the activists who are fighting to defend their communities and their wells and their water quality. The political clout that they have compared to some of these guys is pretty small, right?
Yeah, I would think so. Political clout can be hard to read. I mean, you would see on the State Water Board, for instance, there is Laurel Firestone, who used to previously work for Community Water Center.
Yeah.
So they do have influence, I think, through their allies.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking in the legislature. I mean, I was reading gosh, I wish I remember who wrote the story, but did you read that story we had yesterday or the day before on the Rudy Salas versus, I mean, this is Congress, not the legislature, but Salas versus Valadeo, that congressional district in Kern County? You haven't read it, that's okay.
I have not read it,
No,
sorry.
but I think it said,
but tell me.
I forget if it was either that district or it might have been this factoid for the whole San Joaquin Valley, maybe somebody else here knows, but I think it said that there had never been a Latino representative either for that district or maybe even for the whole San Joaquin Valley in Congress, and it kind of blew my mind to read that because it was like, this district and obviously the valley as a whole is like, overwhelmingly Latino, and it kind of just like, wow, like just interesting to see, how elections take place there. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. No, that's important.
Anyway, kind of a digression, but a related digression, hopefully.
Thank you. Alyssa, I would like to ask you about the Los Angeles County Youth Climate Commission. You are a member. I absolutely understand why they selected you and some of your colleagues, but I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and what your hopes are for what it might achieve.
Sure, so I'm on the Los Angeles Youth County Climate Commission, and I'm representative for District 2, which is right here in downtown LA and surrounding areas. And so as a commission, we're a brand new commission. We're around maybe 2 years now, and we're the first of its kind that even the EPA is looking at us and writing legislature to try and make a federal bill to codify pretty much having youth voices when it comes to climate activism, because people are gonna make decisions and then they're gonna impact the youth for the rest of the time. So right now, as a Youth Climate Commission, we have different kind of activism groups where we're reaching out to districts in our county and trying to get more youth involved. And when we say youth, the group of us are 18 plus, but we really are looking for the 18 and younger, because they're the ones who have to inherit LA County from us and deal with all of what we decide to do with it. And so I'm on the legislative ad hoc committee, so right now we're looking at legislation that would impact both the state and the county.
How about some specifics? What kind of things are you looking at?
Sure, so we're looking at the EPA bill that's gonna codify youth climate councils, and then also we were looking at the Green Amendment, which was one, I forget what SB number it is, but it would pretty much put in the California Constitution that there's a right to a safe and healthy environment for all individuals. So that was a big one for the Climate Commission.
I'll bet. Makes me think of that lawsuit with those young people up there who sued the EPA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we find legislation like that and then bring it to our board of supervisors and we tell them, we're the youth, we believe in this, do something about it because that's your job.
And do you think they're listening?
I hope they are, because we're going to keep making noise about it.
Yeah.
We recently, for District 2, our supervisor does a racial justice movement, and they had one dedicated to environmental policy. That I'm seeing a lot of faces that were there actually in the crowd. Yeah. So something's happening. If the youth are involved, then we're knocking on their doors and telling them they need to be doing stuff.
Yeah.
Which supervisor is that?
Holly J. Mitchell for District 2.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to bring up nuclear power for a minute. Sammy's going. In part because there are some of us in this room that are perhaps old enough to remember all the no nukes, the protests, the concerts, a lot of activism involved in protesting that. Now in some conversations we hear people talking about, well, we're going to have to take another look at solar for a whole lot of reasons. I wonder what kind of activism that might prompt. But Sammy, I'm going to throw that at you. Please.
So I remembered the story I referenced before about the congressional district was by our colleague Melissa Gomez. That was the question, right? I don't have to talk about anything else.
Keep going.
Okay, nuclear power. Yeah, nothing. I've been doing energy reporting for 10 years, and swear to God, there's nothing that sets people off more than when I start to write about nuclear power. So forgive me for being a little bit wary. It's been interesting to see what's developed over the last couple of years. I mean, so for quick background for those who maybe haven't been following it, California has one nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon, or well, one left, Diablo Canyon up along the Central Coast. It's the biggest power plant in the state. It generates something like 6% of our electricity. It was supposed to shut down in the next couple of years. Everyone, in the state legislature and government and PG&E, which operates it, had made this deal that it was going to shut down in no, you just wrote about this recently. What are these, 2024, 25 for the 2 reactors? Were those the years?
Yeah, and it's been extended to 2030.
2030. So Governor Newsom a couple of years ago, after California had these couple of hours of rolling blackouts in 2020 when it got real hot, at the end of summer, which happening more and more frequently with climate change, and it was the end of these 2 hot evenings after sun went down, and people were still running their air conditioners at the end of the day, and we didn't have enough batteries on the grid yet to store the solar power for after the sun went down, and we had rolling blackouts. Newsom made this sort of about face where he had supported this deal to close Diablo Canyon, and he changed his mind. He said, no, we really ought to keep Diablo Canyon around at least for a few more years until we can be really secure in the fact that we know we're not going to have situations like this again with rolling blackouts, until we know that solar and wind and batteries and maybe some other renewable stuff that's not nuclear can keep the lights on 24/7 and also power all of our electric vehicles and electric heating and electric cooking, et cetera. So he was able to push that through the legislature and get this agreement across the finish line to keep Diablo Canyon around through at least 2030. We'll see what happens after that. Nuclear is tricky. It doesn't really, I have found, I have not seen any sort of firm demographic trends in terms of who does and doesn't support nuclear. You've definitely, as Alice said, got a lot of sort of, older school environmental mentality of folks who have been, in the anti-nuclear trenches for a long time, who fought to shut these things down, kind of the Jerry Brown mentality of folks who were trying to get Diablo Canyon shut down, 3 Mile Island back in the day, who still want to see that happen, who see nuclear power as just, terribly risky. What happens if there's an earthquake? What happens if there's a meltdown? What do we do with the spent nuclear fuel, which is still a problem that nobody has really got a solution for? And you see that kind of concern among a lot of younger folks as well. I've definitely seen that in my reporting. And then you've got a whole other mentality of folks who sort of climate change is first and foremost in their minds, for whom those risks are not the biggest problem, who say, well, nuclear is carbon-free energy generation. It's 24/7. You can rely on it. Nuclear accidents, while risky if they were to occur, are extremely few and far between. We know that the fossil fuel plants that are out there generating 24/7 are actively killing people all the time through the air pollution that they cause and through the climate exacerbated weather disasters that are getting worse all the time. Why are we spending so much time worrying about, the small chance that there's a nuclear disaster when we could be extending the life of these facilities or finding ways to build, small modular reactors? That's a technology that Bill Gates is investing in and trying to build out in Wyoming, for instance. And, why are we worrying about that so much when we should be much more worried about climate change? And this is a technology that could help. So those are kind of the 2 schools of thought. It's interesting, I mentioned 3 Mile Island, that nuclear disaster from the 70s. One of those 3 Mile Island reactors in New York Pennsylvania, just shut down, getting my nukes confused, just shut down a couple of years ago, and I just read that it's actually going to be, in theory, restarted for Microsoft, which is trying to power its operations with carbon-free electricity 24/7, and they're building a bunch of new data centers in Pennsylvania, and they're restarting 3 Mile Island to power that. So it's this whole interesting conversation as well, not just of how do we power all of our lives and all of the new electric cars and electric appliances in our homes, but oh God, we're building all of these data centers for our computers and all of the artificial intelligence that's coming online, which is a huge, huge drain on electricity. So it's like, it's one thing to say, let's keep the nuclear power we've got online right now to deal with all of the electric demand that we've got to meet, but do we really need to build out all the artificial intelligence and then create even more electricity demand and use the nuclear power plants for that as well? Wouldn't it be easier if we didn't create all the new electricity demand? It's just, some of that's going to happen no matter what, probably, but just the more demand we create for electricity, the more stuff we need to either build or maintain, and the harder it gets to solve all of these problems. So I don't know if that really answers your question about what do we do about nuclear, but the moral of the story is these are hard problems to solve no matter what. Every energy resource has trade-offs. We need to build and or maintain a lot of stuff and get off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We've just got to find a way to make this as pain-free as possible, but there's going to be some hard choices no matter what.
Sure. So I'm curious if any of you others have thoughts about that. So I'm looking at you, Noah.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about nuclear is that development in the field has it stalled for a long time. After the 3 Mile Island incident, in which I think at least one unit partially melted down, ultimately there's never been any deaths directly linked to it, but the U.S. kind of was hesitant to continue developing the technology, and the safety regulations that were put on them became more intense, which costs more money to bring plants up to the new regulation, to be inspecting them, to be permitting them. And so we're in a situation where a lot of the nuclear plants that exist are kind of old, and using technology that we understand might not be the most cost effective or might not be the safest. And there's been kind of a renewed investment in new ideas where I think, so Bill Gates is helping fund one in Wyoming, and the hope is that this technology will cost half the price and will be 10 times safer. And there's some other smaller modular designs that scientists have been studying. Yes, you have these kind of tech companies having a renewed interest in nuclear, and there's this question of should they be requiring this much energy in the first place, but they are also at least investing in developing new technology that could potentially make nuclear cost competitive again and safer in the long run.
I'd like to add that as far as Gen Z, we haven't really been hurt as much by nuclear as the previous generations. So as far as going with nuclear options, it has a better social license to operate with Gen Z. So from a purely environmental standpoint, you're going to have more Gen Z on board with going nuclear. And as far as big companies using that to power their data mining, Gen Z would probably not like to give up their ChatGPT. So they'll be fine with nuclear powering that.
Thank you. Thoughts?
Well, I was interested to read what Noah learned recently in visiting the Diablo Canyon and reporting on earthquake risks, and it does make you wonder, why did they decide to build it on top of these earthquake faults?
They didn't know they were there.
Yeah, so anyway.
I learned recently listening to Lucy Jones talk, Lucy Jones, the earthquake expert, that before the Northridge quake, we didn't know about the fault that caused the Northridge quake. My God. Anyway.
Good times. I have got a few questions for the audience that came in earlier, and then we'll take the microphone out. Some of these are sort of 30,000-foot questions, but let's try this one. What strategies have you found effective to move organizations from climate curious to climate advocates?
I think it's a lot about turning climate apathy into climate empathy and understanding that there are sacrifice zones in LA and knowing the lived experience of people and what they're dealing with. So being able to relate to that and knowing that even just being able to be in climate activism is a privilege. So to expand that privilege to those who are kept out by either paywalls or just lack of time, and that kind of stuff is really important in getting people more active and more motivated to do something.
I think also the bar used to be like kind of acknowledging climate change and announcing what you were going to do, and I think a lot of activist organizations are raising the bar and asking companies to actually show it. I think, like, especially young folks spend a lot of time online, and I think they have good BS detectors, just getting a lot of information coming in all the time, and I think they really are focused on action. I know we haven't really talked about rage. I know it's in the name of the panel, but I think that's something that can kind of come after climate anxiety. You're worried about these issues a lot, and so you're looking for solutions, and I think rage oftentimes comes up when you see an injustice and don't feel a lot of agency or ability to correct that. And I think that has become motivating for some younger people, and it's also created more of a focus on action instead of just discussing ideas. Especially younger folks.
So to use your rage for good, then. Yeah, okay. Other thoughts about this? No? Here's a question. How can Los Angeles, the state of California, lead the way to a greener future? And is that in the process already? I do think that people who live here, people who live in the state of California, sometimes think, well, you know, we're leaders. Is that true? Anyone?
Well, there's a lot of potential for change.
Okay.
I think some of it could be at the neighborhood level, you know, looking at the built environment and the spaces around us, and where something might be a parking lot, instead it can be made into a green space. And looking at watershed management and how, you know, I've been learning about this recently, how local watersheds in LA could be expanded to give more space for water, and how transportation could be changed and housing patterns so that people don't have to drive so far in the first place. People have talked about all these things, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of clean energy, Los Angeles has a very ambitious goal, 100% clean electricity by 2035, that LA Department of Water and Power is working towards. I mean, I say ambitious, that's what climate scientists and activists generally say is the path that, you know, the nation needs to be on to get to, you know, national and global climate targets, but it is still 10 years ahead of what California has in state law. So, you know, that's going to require a lot of work to get there, building a lot of renewable power in remote locations and importing it into the city and on rooftops within the city, expanding the power grid to be able to accommodate that. So one, meeting that target, and you know, there's kind of 2 halves to the energy transition. One, clean up the electricity supply, and 2, electrify just about everything that you can on top of that. So getting to 100% by 2035 is kind of part 1, and then 2, the electric vehicles and the electric homes, et cetera. So if, you know, we're trying really hard by the 2028 Olympics, there are all of these goals of, you know, a certain number of, you know, getting public transit lines built out on the grid and electric buses, and, you know, whether we're going to meet all those 2028 targets seems somewhat doubtful at this point, but just because you don't do it by 2028 doesn't mean if you do it by 29 or 2030 that's not super worthwhile. So I would say those are 2 areas where LA could, you know, try to lead the state.
Sure.
And for what it's worth, California is perceived as a leader. So New York Climate Week is happening this week, and there's a lot of people from California there. And I spoke to some people that are involved and were organizing, and they say that that organization looks to California as a leader and a leading voice at the table, ahead on electrification and policy, but more importantly, just the spirit of the Californian people. People at New York Climate Week were saying that they just view Californians as taking this issue seriously and willing to take action for it. For example, the American Climate Corps was announced last year, and to help mobilize young people, especially to take action on climate change and contribute to kind of a greater cause. And that was in part modeled off of the California Climate Action Corps, which started 4 years before that.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. With the increasingly dire environmental crises, communicating about climate issues is more important than ever. How do we make sure that audiences for non-traditional media, youth, low income, how do we make sure that they're hearing about what we have to say, about what needs to be said?
I think first and foremost, keeping conversations on climate accessible, not having a paywall, making sure that they're in spaces that are accessible to people, so that can be reached by public transportation or by foot, and having walkable areas. So doing a panel like this maybe at a public park rather than at the Colburn School, but something like that.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, I think you got to meet people where they're at. Talking about the California Climate Action Corps, again, they've actually been quite successful in reaching a large range of people. You have two types of people there. One is people that probably got a degree in environmental engineering. They feel that rage. They've been thinking about climate. They've been camping their whole life and want to take action. Fantastic. There's also a lot of people where people from the California Climate Action Corps and other corps around the state go out into communities, go to job fairs at high schools, and pitch it as this is a job opportunity. This is going to be a career space with a lot of open jobs in the next decades, and here's a program where you can join, no experience required, and we'll provide career services afterward. And people are like, oh, okay, like try it out, apply, and then just by doing the work, by being invested in, like if they're helping maintain trails and feeling a connection to the forest that they're in, or they're helping put up solar and can see the projects that they've done and the power that they've put on the grid, then develop a connection and a passion for dealing with the climate crisis.
Yeah, that's such an important question, and the one thing I would add in terms of accessibility, I'm thinking of the reporting that we do, and Alyssa, your comment about not putting things behind a paywall, I hear that, and it's tough for me as a journalist because, of course, as the LA Times, it's like we need people to pay for the work that we do, otherwise we're not going to have jobs because we need salaries and to be able to do it for a living. And there are different models of journalism, and there are great nonprofits out there doing the work that are able to not put their work behind a paywall, and I encourage everyone to support them. I guess the two things I would say on that is, one, for people who can, and I imagine there are some of you in this room, for people who can afford to support the work that we're doing, please do that, because the more of you who support our journalism and are able to pay for it and who may not be doing it right now, that enables us to put more of it outside the paywall for others who can't. So please subscribe to the LA Times. LATimes.com/subscribe. And in terms of just for if you'll forgive a tiny bit of self-promotion here, but I write a newsletter called Boiling Point, LATimes.com/Boiling Point. That is, if you sign up for the email edition, put your email in, you will get that in your inbox. It is not behind a paywall. That is free for all. So that's one answer to the question there.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Maybe we can take some questions from the audience. I see some hands up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the great discussions. And Alice, I'm sorry, this is a 30-foot-long question. Research tells us that the most effective way to engage people in the climate conversation, or at least engage older Americans who are still calling most of the shots, is to keep the message close to home. At the same time, we know that climate change is a global problem that disproportionately affects other parts of the world, specifically the global south. My home country of Brazil and other parts of South America are in flames right now because of beef, which is something we didn't quite discuss in the lifestyle section.
We can talk about beef.
Yeah, flooding is happening in Europe. Vast areas of the African continent are increasingly becoming unbearable. And then, of course, we have a growing number of climate refugees. So my question for the panel is, what are your thoughts on ways we could talk about international climate justice without alienating Americans, if that's possible?
No big deal, right?
I can just start by saying I think it definitely is hard to get Americans to look beyond ourselves and look beyond what's going on in our neighborhood and in our own backyards. But the conversation on climate is very intersectional and universal because it is our planet, and that planet being the global south, North America, and every other continent and ocean, and every entity that exists within the planet. So those conversations need to be had, and I think a great way to start is locally, because you educate each other on what is going on around the world, and then you push your representatives to have those conversations with the leaders from the other world and explain what's going on for them in their countries and what we can do to make a difference together.
More questions?
Hi, I'm a Mexican-born immigrant, also environmental justice advocate, and when it comes to nuclear power, I would also question, like, who would live in the uranium mines? Like, who would be that affected community? And more than anything, one of the things that Friends of the Earth found out was not only 1 billion fish are killed every year because of the intake of the ocean water to cool the reactors, but also if, in terms of the one-through cooling policy, if you were to combine all the power plants that are in the coast, if you take Diablo Canyon off, that's 80% of all the water that is used to cool turbines combined. So I would like to see like what Ian or Sammy Roth had to say about that. Thanks.
I was not aware of that. And that seems like a significant concern. And I actually have not covered the topic of once-through cooling, so I think I'm not the best person to answer this question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I don't have an extended answer except to say that there's significant concerns for sure, as you know, as I would say, unfortunately, there are with most energy sources, but I haven't delved into that recently, so I'm going to reserve that for when I eventually get to that story in more detail.
I would just want to say that, I know this question was directed at me, but in terms of nuclear and the amount of water that it uses, that's like one of my fellow panelists were saying, a lot of the nuclear that exists now, the technology is outdated. And so what is being researched right now is the use of reclaimed water to be used as a cooling source for those nuclear power plants. So with reclaimed water, it's less of pulling directly from ocean sources and groundwater sources and using the recycled water that we have already put into our system.
Thank you. We have time maybe for one more question, two more questions.
Hi, I really appreciate all these panels, and I just wanted to hear from you all personally. What do you do when you encounter someone who really doesn't care about the climate or doesn't believe in climate change? What do you do personally to, just in a one-on-one conversation, to persuade them to maybe see things a little differently or consider something a little differently besides, you know, the price of gasoline, for example, for them?
I push back and I start with the data and the science and what is agreed upon about what we're seeing. And those can be hard conversations. There are some people I've encountered who look at, say, the future of farming in a region and just want to believe it's going to be better, you know, down the road. But the science indicates it's not. And so I just try to, you know, when discussing it with them, go back to what the science tells us. And sure, there are a lot of uncertainties. But if you look at the Colorado River, for instance, the science indicates that the warming that's in our environment now is causing a decrease in the flow that the whole region will need to be prepared for. So I think to deny that, looking forward at the future, would put us, to put it mildly, at a big disadvantage.
I have a maybe slightly heretical answer to this question, which is that, especially in my journalism and also in person when I encounter people, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about or making an effort trying to reach people, especially people who are climate deniers, but frankly also people who just don't seem to care or, aren't worried about it. Like, I kind of think at this point in 2024, if you don't believe it or you just don't care about it or don't think it's anything to be concerned about, like, there's not a lot that I can do to convince you otherwise. Or even if there maybe are a few, like, fringe cases out there, or if I work really hard, maybe I can convince you. I just don't know that that's that good a use of my time and energy. There are just so many people, the people that I'm focused on in my writing, who I really think that it's worth expending time and energy on, or because there are so many of these people who, and there are polls that show this, there are so many people who will, if you ask them, do you care about climate change, will say, oh yeah, for sure, like that's something that matters to me. But who, if you ask them, where does it rank among other things they care about, like when, what's going to matter to you when you go to vote, for instance, it's like 12th on their list. Those are the people that I'm trying to reach most of all in my reporting and in my conversations when I'm out there in the world. People who know that it's real, who know that it's important, who know that, like, in theory, like, this is going to affect their lives and affect their, children and grandchildren, but who in practice, other stuff is first and foremost in their mind. I think that those are people who are really, like, if you tell the right stories and if you have the right conversations, and who, if you can just remind them again and again, like, here's what's happening with extreme weather, and here are the ways that you can create change, and here are the things that you can be thinking about when you go to vote, and with the products that you buy, and with, the types of media that you consume, and with the types of accounts you follow on social media, and with the types of things that you think about in your daily life. I think that's where you can really make a difference, where I can make a difference as a journalist, where maybe you can make a difference as an activist, or with your choices and your habits and what you buy. To me, that's a lot more worthwhile than focusing on how do I change the minds of these people who clearly don't want their minds to be changed.
Yeah, I agree with Sammy that the goal isn't to convince 100% of people. Like, it's probably a waste of effort to first convince a flat earther that the earth is round and then move on to climate change. But I think that for climate deniers, part of the problem is a mistrust in science, or a misunderstanding of the scientific method. And I think it's important to meet people where they're at. There are valid reasons to mistrust science. It's hurt people before. It can be elitist. There's pressures on scientists to just publish and care about their egos and image and things like that. And then also, just like in terms of the scientific method, explaining to people that scientists' their job is to be skeptical of climate change, and to poke and prod it, and to try to, like, create every argument that they possibly can that this isn't what's happening. And only when they're able to disprove all of these do they say that climate change is real and here's the evidence for it. And I think even kind of employing the scientific method in your conversation, like, oh, what are your concerns, and like, how can we kind of tease out what's true and what's not, can be helpful. And you're not going to change someone's mind in one conversation, but if this is someone that's, like, close to you, a family member, a close friend, focusing on empathy first and understanding their perspective and just hearing them out and then building from there is how I would approach it.
I'd also say, if you ever have the displeasure of needing to have that conversation face to face with a climate denier, a good conversation starter is always talk about the weather. So typically, they're probably from the older generation, so you could be like, oh, remember that heat wave we had in September? When you were a kid riding your bike around, did you have heat waves in September? And they'd say, oh, no, maybe I don't really remember that. It's like, oh, so would you say the climate has changed?
I think you solved it. That's
right? Like, that's climate change right there. Who needs scientists for that?
And I also think, through our coverage, we are trying to cover these topics with a lot of depth, talking with a lot of different people, and really bring the conversation out more. And so I hope that we may be helping with that some through our reporting.
Thank you. One more question?
Yeah, really appreciate this morning. Seminal moment. Mr. James, I'm sorry I didn't have a face to go with your name, but I've read all your stories. Terrific stuff, Mr. Roth, also. I think it's dealing with how we call these things that Ms. Xia was talking about is extremely important. I'm very sorry that Ms. Pertell couldn't be here today, because we out in Riverside County suffer, and just in the last 2 weeks, we had the worst smog A combination of the fire smoke, regional smog, local diesel particulates, all aimed directly at us, and this is what Ms. Pertel was going to talk about, the really terrible health impacts of this noxious combination. And one of the issues that I'm not sure, maybe needs to be addressed, here you've got these terrific young people going out and putting their shoulder to the wheel, going out and demonstrating, often not knowing who's responsible. Take air quality, who is responsible? We have 4 or 5 agencies, federal, international down at the ports, okay, the state CARB, then the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is a region so opaque. Where do you direct, and do we need to study how best to direct our comments to those that are responsible for this? Because it's a divided, opaque, messy legislative landscape, let alone the courts. We haven't even got to the courts. But is that something that would help people be much more effective with their limited time in being able to go to the right places to address their concerns?
I mean, yes. No, it can be opaque. There are way too many acronyms involved. I mean, unless you do this for a living full time, it can be just like, even as a reporter, sometimes like, God, which agency do I have to go to for this? I mean, I think the really simple version would be, most of the time for someone who's busy with other stuff and just needs, what's the most effective thing I can do? It's elections, it's politicians. Ultimately it's the legislature and it's Congress and it's, local county supervisors and it's the president and it's people like that who pass the laws that tell the agencies what they have to do. And if the agencies don't listen, they have to tell them again sometimes. And they're the ones appointing the judges, or you're maybe electing the judges locally. I mean, that's where it starts. So that would be my advice to folks who really want to make a change, is that it starts with who you elect to office. And that's why I'm going to be putting out a climate voters guide for California and for Southern California in particular. Climate can't just be something that, climate has to be really something that you're thinking about when you're going to the ballot box and something that you're thinking about when you're deciding who to vote for. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Thank you. Any final thoughts here before we conclude about anything we've been talking about?
Rage,
okay. Thank you. And thank all of you for coming here on a Thursday morning. Greatly appreciate it, and we are grateful for your interest in this really important topic. So thank you. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so grateful for the extraordinary journalists here who do their work day in and day out with incredible diligence and dedication and passion. Thank you all for being here on stage and giving us this great program. I hope the audience really got a lot out of it. I certainly did, and I read this coverage, and I'm a huge fan, and I hope you are. I want to again thank the California Center for Climate Change Education at West Los Angeles College for being a sponsor of this event, and I think it's hugely important. And finally, I want to thank all of you here, because journalism to me is a two-way street. And for all of our dedication and expertise and hard work, we wouldn't make a difference, and we wouldn't be able to help change the world unless our work were absorbed and used by our readers and listeners and viewers. So ultimately, it's you that's going to make the difference. And I want to thank you for supporting the LA Times and for journalism in this city. So thank you all for attending.